Good morning. I'm Jim Durkin, House Republican leader from Western Springs, Illinois. I'm joined today with Deputy Leader Tom Demmer of Dixon and also Assistant Minority Leader Ryan Spain of Peoria. Despite being promised that new day in Illinois when the Speaker took office, what we saw play out during this year's budget process was a familiar song and dance, very Madigan-esque. Well, early on, Democrats made a show of inviting Republicans to these working groups to solicit our input. The input was quickly disregarded, and Republicans were cut out of the process altogether after those initial meetings. Ultimately, the FY23 budget was crafted behind closed doors between the governor and the House Democrats and the Senate Democrats. These backroom deals and secrecy drives fiscal chaos in this state and also breeds corruption. As a caucus, we have advocated for greater transparency in the budgeting process. We strongly believe that all spending bills should be thoroughly vetted in both chambers and that ample time should be provided for public comment for the spending of taxpayer money. What happened this spring was far from that idea and that goal. Now, the Democrats talk a real good game on open government, but they never follow through and do just the opposite. We saw it this year under Speaker Welch, and I've seen it for decades with Mike Madigan. Nothing has changed. You'd think they'd learn a lesson. The budget compromise between the Democrats was announced to myself and also the minority leader in the Senate minutes before it was announced to the press. J.B. Pritzker and the guys just wanted to check off the box. It was kind of a joke. It lasted 10 minutes. Even then, we didn't see the details until more than a day later, just hours before we were asked to vote on a 3,000-page, $46.3 billion spending plan in Illinois. This is not how good government works, and we're seeing that play out in the federal court day in and day out. And as I said earlier, you would hope they'd learn a lesson, but they don't. I'd like to turn it over right now to Deputy Leader Tom Demmer.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm State Representative Tom Demmer from Dixon. As we look at the fiscal year 23 state budget, Illinoisans should be concerned for two reasons: taxes and more taxes. The budget that Democrats passed this year sets Illinoisans up for a series of tax increases in future years as a result of their inevitably increasing spending at a time when revenues are declining. We've talked a lot about the last couple of years how unusual some of these state budgets have been, given the heavy reliance on federal COVID relief dollars. But if we just look at normal state spending, normal state operations for education and public safety and healthcare, normal state spending is growing by over 10% in this year's budget at a time which revenues are declining, perhaps as much as by 5%, setting us up in future years for a cliff where our spending growth will continue to outpace revenue growth, and Democrats in Illinois, like they have over the last several years, will have no choice but to come back to taxpayers and say, we need yet another income tax increase. Or Governor Pritzker will reboot his effort to try to convince voters to pass a graduated tax amendment that they just so recently rejected. This year's budget appropriates money out of federal COVID relief dollars for Democratic pork projects, capital projects in Democratic-only districts. They've chosen to use federal dollars that came to Illinois to try to help us deal with the economic impact of the global pandemic, and instead have directed those dollars toward capital projects that have nothing to do with COVID in Democratic-only districts. What does this lead to? Well, it leads to COVID relief dollars being spent on those pork projects instead of paying off existing debt that we have in our unemployment insurance trust fund. What happens when we have debt in the UI trust fund? Well, two things. There's a tax increase on every job in the state of Illinois, and there's a benefit reduction for every worker in the state of Illinois. They chose to prioritize pork projects over the best interest of Illinois jobs and Illinois workers. Additionally, in this year's budget, we see hundreds, literally hundreds, of dedicated line item appropriations to projects that came at the request of Democratic-only legislators to groups and organizations across the state who never have appeared before any committee of the House or the Senate, who have never made public requests, who have never talked about how those dollars will be used. We have hundreds of examples of directed line grants that simply say to go to this organization for operations. Whatever that means, the state has no ability now to tie that to any performance metric, to try to reach any specific goal with it. It just says to operations. There's no oversight, there's no check, and there's no balance. These are the kind of budget games that Illinoisans are rightfully cynical about. This is what happens when a budget gets put together at the last minute, passed in the middle of the night, and Democrats need to include this kind of pork in order to buy off the votes they need to ram through another partisan and gimmick-filled budget. I think Illinoisans should rightfully ask, do we want Illinois government to be set up for an inevitable tax increase in the future? At a time of record inflation across the country, is it wise to spend taxpayer dollars on pork projects used to buy off votes for members? I think most Illinoisans would say no. I'll now turn it over to Representative Ryan Spain.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning. I'm State Representative Ryan Spain from Peoria, and I think today we're calling foul and taking strong exception with the focus that Democratic legislators made on delivering pork projects to their districts alone, instead of focusing on the important issues that are affecting the lives and livelihoods of people in Illinois each and every day. Just remember, a few months ago in March, we saw the indictment of longtime Speaker Mike Madigan, what should have been a wake-up call to everyone about the continued need for ethics reforms in the state of Illinois. Instead, we saw Democrats taking a different approach, focusing on any other issue possible, and again, using their majorities to deliver unique projects only for their districts, instead of understanding that there is a cost that all of us as taxpayers and residents pay, a cost of corruption in the state of Illinois, and it's a high time we focus on making meaningful reforms. Number two, at a time when inflation is out of control, we saw budget year gimmicks, election year gimmicks imposed by Democrats instead of taking the true steps to make changes that would be beneficial to the state of Illinois. My colleague, Representative Demmer, had proposed a number of solutions that would deliver tax credits and more meaningful benefits to our families instead of the de minimis gains and election gimmicks that were proposed by Democrats. Remember, at the end of session, we spent a large amount of time arguing with Governor Pritzker's office about placing stickers on every gas pump in the state of Illinois to remind voters of the 2-cent savings per gallon that the governor would deliver for them. I think it's a mockery of the real needs that the people of Illinois are facing right now, and we chose to focus on tricks and gimmicks that were delivered by the Democrats. Most importantly, though, and the issue that we hear about all throughout the state, in all of our communities, is the huge issue of public safety and the rampant crime and chaos that is taking place throughout the state of Illinois. It is time for us to focus on a public safety agenda that can bring law enforcement officers back in the numbers and areas that we need to see throughout the state of Illinois. Democrats should admit, and we would work together to say, Democrats have acted in haste with the passage of House Bill 3653, the Safety Act. It has created tremendous damage to the community of law enforcement and to criminal activity throughout the state of Illinois. And we're just seeing the beginning, because as the Democrats point out again and again, many of the provisions of the Safety Act have yet to take effect. So just wait till we see things like the elimination of cash bail in January and the further difficulty and erosion of public safety that will take place in the state of Illinois. We need to be focused on these key issues: corruption, cost of living, crime, and not election year gimmicks and Democratic pork projects to secure the votes of their members, and not meaningful reforms that we need to move our state forward.